Continuing Antony from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. I think we are at Antony first entertained Caesar, that this also being a concession on Caesar's part to his sister, and when at length an agreement was made between them that Caesar should give Antony 2 of his legions to serve him in the Parthian war, and that Antony should in return leave with him 100 armed galleys. Octavia further obtained of her husband, besides this, 20 light ships for her brother, and of her brother 1,000 foot for her husband. So having parted good friends, Caesar went immediately to make war with Pompey to conquer Sicily, and Antony, leaving in Caesar's charge his wife and children, and his children by his former wife, Fulvia, set sail for Asia. But the mischief that had lain still, the passion for Cleopatra, which better thoughts had seemed to have lulled and charmed into oblivion, upon his approach to Syria, gathered strength again, and broke out into a flame, and in fine, like Plato's restive and rebellious horse of the human soul. Not the Bhagavad Gita, doesn't it talk about the 3-horsed self? Flinging off all good and wholesome counsel, and breaking fairly loose, he sends Fonteius Capito to bring Cleopatra into Syria, to whom at her arrival he made no small or trifling present. Vo Inicia, co ada Syria, Capris, great part of Cilicia, that side of Judea which produces balm, that part of Arabia where the Nabathans extend to the outer sea, profuse gifts which much displeased the Romans, for although he had invested several private persons in great governments and kingdoms, and bereaved many kings of theirs, as Antigonus of Judea, whose head he caused to be struck off, the first example of that punishment being inflicted on a king, yet nothing stung the Romans like the shame of these honors paid to Cleopatra. Their dissatisfaction was augmented also by his acknowledging as his own the twin children he had by her, giving them the name of Alexander and Cleopatra, and adding, as their surname, the titles of Sun and Moon. But he who knew how to put a good color on the most dishonest action would say that the greatness of the Roman Empire consisted more in giving than in taking kingdoms, and that the way to carry noble blood through the world was by begetting in every place a new line and series of kings. His own ancestor had thus been born of Hercules. Hercules had not limited his hopes of progeny to a single womb, nor feared any law like Solon's, or any audit of procreation, but had freely let nature take her will in the foundation and first commencement of many families. Well, it's thought that Hercules was a Ice Age or pre-Ice Age individual that, or end of the Ice Age individual that the story built up over time. There's reasons for that. After Phraates had killed his father Herodes and taken possession of his kingdom, many of the Parthians left their country. Among the rest, Manassas, a man of great distinction and authority, sought refuge with Antony, who, looking on his case as similar to that of Themistocles, and likening his own opulence and magnanimity to those of the former Persian kings, gave him 3 cities, Larissa, Arathasa, and Hierapolis, which was formerly called Bambuca. But when the king of Parthia soon recalled him, giving him his word and honor for his safety, Antony was not unwilling to give him leave to return, hoping thereby to surprise Phraates, who would believe that peace would continue, for he only made the demand of him that he should send back to the Roman ensigns, which were taken when Crassus was slain, and the prisoners that remained yet alive. This done, he sent to Cleopatra to Egypt, and marched through Arabia and Armenia, and when his forces came together and were joined by those of his confederate kings, of whom there were very many, and the most considerable Artavasdes, king of Armenia, who came to the head of 6,000 horse and 7,000 foot. He made a general muster. There appeared 60,000 Roman foot, 10,000 horse, Spaniards and Gauls, who counted as Romans, and of other nations, horse and foot, 30,000, and these great preparations that put the Indians beyond Bactria, the real Indians, into alarm, and made all Asia shake, were all we are told rendered useless to him because of Cleopatra, for in order to pass the winter with her, the war was pushed on before its due time, and all he did was done without perfect consideration, as by a man who had no power of control over his faculties, who, under the effect of some drug or magic, was still looking back elsewhere, and whose object was much more to hasten his return than the conqueror's enemies. For, first of all, when he should have taken up his winter quarters in Armenia to refresh his men who were tired with long marches, and having come at least 8,000 furlongs, and then having taken the advantage in the beginning of the spring to invade Media before the Parthians were out of winter quarters, he had not patience to expect his time, but marched into the province of Atropatena, leaving Armenia on the left hand, and laid waste all that country. Secondly, his haste was so great that he left behind the engines absolutely required for any siege, which followed the camp in 300 wagons, and among the rest, a ram 80 feet long, barricade breaker, none of which it was possible, if lost or damaged, to repair or to make the like, as the provinces of Upper Asia produce no trees long or hard enough for such uses. Nevertheless, he left them all behind as a mere impediment to his speed in the charge of his detachment, under the command of Statianus, the wagon officer. He himself laid siege to Phraates, a principal city of the king of Media, wherein were that king's wife and children, and when actual needs proved the greatness of his error in leaving the siege train behind him, he had nothing for it but to come up and raise a mound against the walls with infinite labor and great loss of time. Meantime, Phraates, coming down with a large army, and hearing that the wagons were left behind with the battering engines, sent a strong party of horse, by which Statianus was surprised, he himself and 10,000 of his men slain, the engines all broken in pieces, many taken prisoners, and among the rest King Polemon. This great miscarriage in the opening of the campaign much discouraged Antony's army, and Artavasdes, king of Armenia, deciding that the Roman prospects were bad, withdrew with all his forces from the camp. Although he had been the chief promoter of the war, the Parthians, encouraged by their successes, came up to the Romans at the siege, and gave them many affronts, upon which Antony, fearing that the despondency and alarm of his soldiers would only grow worse if he let them lie idle, taking all the horse, 10 legions, and 3 praetorian cohorts of heavy infantry, resolved to go out and forage, designing by this means to draw the enemy with more advantage to a battle. To effect this, he marched a day's journey from his camp, and finding the Parthians hovering about in readiness to attack him, while he was in motion, he gave orders for the signal of battle to be hung out in the encampment, but at the same time pulled down the tents, as if he meant not to fight, but to lead his men home again. And as he proceeded to lead them past the enemy, who were drawn up in a half moon, his orders being that the horse should charge as soon as the legions were come up near enough to second them, the Parthians, standing while the Romans marched by them, were in great admiration of their army. Out of exact discipline, it observed rank after rank, passing on at equal distances in perfect order and silence, their pikes already in their hands. But when the signal was given, and the horse turned short upon the Parthians, and with loud cries charged them, they bravely received them, though they were at once too near for them. They were too near for bow shot. But the legions coming up with loud shouts and rattling of their arms so frightened their horses, and indeed the men themselves, that they kept their ground no longer. Antony pressed them hard, in great hopes that the victory should put an end to the war. The foot had them in pursuit for 50 furlongs, and the horse for thrice that distance, and yet the advantage summed up. They had but 30 prisoners, and there were but 80 slain, so that they were all filled with dejection and discouragement to consider that when they were victorious, their advantages were so small, and that when they were beaten, they lost so great a number of men, as they had done when the carriages were taken. The next day, having put the baggage in order, they marched back to the camp before Frata. It was based on something with a ah in the middle there, but just because they don't make that sound, just because they have a double A. In the way, meeting with some scattering troops of the enemy, and as they marched further with greater parties at length, with the body of the enemy's army fresh and in good order, who defied them to battle, and charged them on every side, and it was not without great difficulty that they reached the camp. There Antony, finding that his men had in a panic deserted the defense of the mound, and upon a sally of the Metis, resolved to proceed against them by decimation, as it is called, which is done by dividing the soldiers into tens, and out of every 10, putting one to death, as it happens by lot. Okay, because I thought somebody had to die. The rest, he gave orders, should have, instead of wheat, their rations of corn and barley. Corn is in grain. Decimetian, if we're going to give it a Latin pronunciation, because they don't say s with a C, they always make the K sound. The war was now become grievous to both parties, and the prospect of its continuance yet more fearful to Antony, in respect that he was threatened with famine, for he could no longer forage without wounds and slaughter, and Phraates, on the other side, was full of apprehension that if the Romans were to persist in carrying on the siege, the autumnal equinox being past and the air already closing in for cold, he should be deserted by his soldiers, who would suffer anything rather than wintering in open field, to prevent which he had recourse to the following deceit, he gave orders to those of his men who had made most acquaintance among the Roman soldiers not to pursue too close when they met them foraging, but to suffer them to carry off some provision. Moreover, that they should praise their valor, and declare that it was not without just reason that their king looked upon the Romans as the bravest men in the world. This done, upon further opportunity, they rode nearer in, and drawing up their horses by the men, began to revile Antony for his obstinacy, that, whereas Phraates desired nothing more than peace, and an occasion to show how ready he was to save the lives of so many brave soldiers, he, on the contrary, gave no opening to any friendly offers, but sat awaiting the arrival of the two fiercest and worst enemies, winter and famine, from whom it would be hard for them to make their escape, even with all the goodwill of the Parthians to help them. Antony, having these reports from many bands, began to indulge the hope, nevertheless, that he would not send any message to the Parthian till he had put the question to these friendly talkers, whether what they said was said by order of their king, receiving answer that it was, together with new encouragement to believe them. He sent some of his friends to demand once more the standards and prisoners, lest, if he should ask nothing, he might be supposed to be too thankful to have leave to retreat in quiet. The Parthian king made answer that as for the standards and prisoners, he need not trouble himself, but if he thought fit to retreat, he might do it when he pleased, in peace and safety. Some few days, therefore, being spent in collecting the baggage, he sent out upon his march, upon which occasion, though there was no man of his time like him for addressing a multitude, or for carrying soldiers with him by the force of words, out of shame and sadness he could not find in his heart to speak himself, but employed Domitius Anobarbus, and some of the soldiers resented it as an undervaluing of them, but the greater number saw the true cause, and pitied it, and thought it rather a reason why they, on their side, should treat their general excuse me, I guess is the response, with more respect and obstinacy than ordinary. More respect and obedience than ordinary. Okay, I think I said something else. Antony had resolved to return by the same way he came, which was through a level country, clear of all trees. But a certain Mardian came to him, one that was very conversant with the manners of the Parthians, and whose fidelity to the Romans had been tried at the battle where the machines were lost, and advised him to keep the mountains close on his right hand, and not to expose his men, heavily armed in a broad, open, riding country, to the attacks of a numerous army of light horse and archers, that Phraates, with fair promises, had persuaded him from the siege on purpose, that he might, with more ease, cut him off in his retreat. But if he so pleased, he would conduct him by a nearer route, on which, moreover, he should find the necessaries for his army in greater abundance. Antony, upon this, began to consider what was best to be done. He was unwilling to seem to have any mistrust of the Parthians after their treaty, but holding it to be really best to march his army on the shorter and more inhabited way, he demanded of the Mardian some assurance of his faith, who offered himself to be bound until the army came safe into Armenia. 2 days he conducted the army bound, and on the third, when Antony had given up all thought of the enemy, and was marching at his case in no very good order, the Mardian, perceiving the bank of the river broken down, and the water let out and overflowing the road by which they were to pass, saw at once that this was the handiwork of the Parthians, done out of mischief, and to hinder the march, So he advised Antony to be upon his guard, for that the enemy was nigh at hand. And no sooner had he begun to put his men in order, disposing the slingers and dartmen in convenient intervals for sallying out, but the Parthians came pouring in on all sides, fully expecting to encompass them and throw the whole army into disorder. They were at once attacked by the light troops, whom beguiled a good deal with their arrows, but being themselves as warmly entertained with the slings and darts, and many wounded, they made the retreat, soon after rallying up afresh. They were beat back by a battalion of Gallic horse, and appeared no more that day. By their manner of attack, Antony, seeing what to do, not only placed the slings and darts as a rear guard, but also lined both flanks with them, and so marched in a square battle, giving order to the horse to charge and beat off the enemy, but not to follow them far as they retired, so that the Parthians, not doing more mischief for the 4 ensuing days than they received, began to abate in their zeal, and complaining that the winter season was much advanced, pressed for returning home. But on the 5th day, Flavius Gallus, a brave and active officer, who had a considerable command in the army, came to Antony, desiring of him some light infantry out of the rear, and some horse out of the front, which he would undertake to do some considerable service, which, when he had obtained, he beat the enemy back, not withdrawing as was usual at the same time, and retreating upon the mass of the heavy infantry, but maintaining his own ground and engaging bodily. The officers who commanded in the rear, perceiving how far he was getting from the body of the army, sent to warn him back, but he took no notice of them. It is said that Titius, the quaestor, snatched the standards and turned them round, upbraiding Gallus with thus leading so many brave men to destruction. But when he, on the other side, reviled him again, and commanded the men that were about him to stand firm, Titius made his retreat, and Gallus, charging the enemies in the front, was encompassed by a party that fell upon his rear, which at length perceiving, he sent a messenger to demand succor. But the commanders of the heavy infantry, Canidius, isn't that like a medical condition? No, something similar though. Among others, a particular favorite of Antony's, seem here to have committed a great oversight, for instead of facing about with the whole body, they sent small parties, and when they were defeated, they still sent out small parties, so that by their bad management, the rout would have spread through the whole army if Antony himself had not marched from the van at the head of the 3rd Legion, and passing this through among the fugitives facing the enemies, and hindered them from any further pursuit. In this engagement were killed 3,500, were carried back to the camp wounded. Among the rest, Gallus shot through the body with 4 arrows, of which wounds he died. Antony went from tent to tent to visit and comfort the rest of them, and was not able to see his men without tears and a passion of grief. They, however, seized his hand with joyful faces, bidding him go and see to himself, and not be concerned about them, calling him their emperor and their general, as saying that if he did well, they were safe. For in short, never in all these times can history make mention of a general at the head of a more splendid army, whether you consider strength in youth, or patience in sufferance, in labors and fatigues. But as for the obedience and affectionate respect they bore their general, and the unanimous feeling amongst small and great alike, officers and common soldiers, to prefer his good opinion of them to their very lives and being. In this part of military excellence, it was not possible that they could have been surprised by the very Romans of old. For this devotion, as I have said before, there were many reasons, as the nobility of his family, his eloquence, his frank and open manners, his liberal and magnificent habits, his familiarity in talking with everybody, and at this time particularly his kindness in visiting and pitying the sick, joining in all their pains and furnishing them with all things necessary, so that the sick and the wounded were even more eager to serve than those that were whole and strong. Now, whatever cause we are upon, one of the things is definitely we've got, our lives and such, they're a means. So you want to be pleasing to the cause, and of course people get fanatical about individual leaders. But that's not the thing. What's the Quran say? That if he dies or is killed, will you turn your backs? Will you turn on your heels and that sort of thing? So it's not about. So that wasn't about Muhammad being alive, and or whether or not he, met with one end or another. But some people are like that. Oh, the leader has died. I'm going to quit my religion now. Nevertheless, this last victory had so encouraged the enemy that instead of their former impatience and weariness, they began soon to feel contempt for the Romans, staying all night near the camp in expectation of plundering their tents and baggage, which they concluded they must abandon, and in the morning new forces arrived in large masses, so that their number was grown to be not less, it is said, than 40,000 horse, and the king had sent the very guards that attended upon his own person as to assure an unquestioned victory, for he himself was never present at any fight. Antony, designing to harangue the soldiers, called for a morning habit, that he might move them the more, but was dissuaded by his friends, so he came forward in the general's scarlet cloak, and addressed them, praising those that had gained the victory, and reproaching those that had fled, the former answering him with promises of success, and the latter excusing themselves and telling him they were ready to undergo decimation, or any other punishment he should please to inflict upon them, only entreating that he would forget and not discompose himself with their faults, at which he lifted up his hands to heaven and prayed to what he considered to be gods. Is the word damans, so praying to the jinn, that if to balance the great favors he had received of them, any judgment lay in store, they would pour it upon his head alone and grant his soldiers victory. The next day they took better order for their march, and the Parthians, who thought they were marching rather to plunder than to fight, were much taken aback when they came up and were received with a shower of missiles, to find the enemy not disheartened but fresh and resolute, so that they themselves began to lose courage. But at the descent of a hill where the Romans were obliged to pass, they got together and let fly their arrows upon them as they moved slowly down. But the full armored infantry, facing round, received the light troops within, and those in the first rank knelt on one knee, holding their shields before them, the next rank holding theirs over the first, and so again others over these, much like the tilling of a house, are the rows. The tiling. Okay, yeah. Are the rows of seats in a theater, the whole affording sure defense against arrows, which glanced upon them without doing any harm. The Parthians, seeing the Romans down upon their knees, could not imagine but that it must proceed from weariness, so that they laid down their bows, and taking up their spears, made a fierce onset, when the Romans, with a great cry, leaped upon their feet, striking hand to hand with their javelins, slew the foremost, and put the rest to flight. After this rate it was every day, and the trouble they gave made the marches short, in addition to which famine began to be felt in the camp, for they could get but little corn, and that which they got they were forced to fight for, and besides this, they were in want of implements to grind it and make bread. Well, they should learn how to bash things with rocks and spend more time chewing, obviously. For they had left almost all behind, the baggage, horses, being dead or otherwise employed in carrying the sick and wounded. Provision was so scarce in the army that an Attic quart of wheat sold for 50 drachmas, and barley loaves for their weight in silver, and when they tried vegetables and roots, they found such as are commonly eaten very scarce, so that they were constrained to venture upon any they could get, and among others they chanced upon an herb that was mortal, first taking away all sense and understanding. He that had eaten of it remembered nothing in the world, and employed himself only in moving great stones from one place to another, which he did with as much earnestness and industry as if it had been a business of greatest consequence. Through all the camp there was nothing to be seen but men grubbing upon the ground at stones, which they carried from place to place. But in the end they threw up bile and died, as wine moreover, which was the one antidote, failed. When Antony saw them die so fast, and the Parthians still in pursuit, was heard to exclaim several times over, "Oh, the 10,000!" as if in admiration of the retreat of the Greeks, with Xenophon, who then, when they had a longer journey to make from Babylonia, and a more powerful enemy to deal with, nevertheless came home safe. There's some long sentences in here, so I have another minute than I thought. The Parthians, finding that they could not divide the Roman army, nor break the order of the battle, and that withal they had been so often worsted, once more began to treat the foragers with professions of humanity. They came to them with their bows unbent, telling them that they were going home to their houses, that this was the end of their retaliation, and that only some Median troops would follow for 2 or 3 days, not with any design to annoy them, but for the defense of some of the villages further on. And saying this, they saluted them and embraced them with a great show of friendship. This made the Romans full of confidence again, and Antony, on hearing it, was more disposed to take the road through the level country, being told that no water was to be hoped for on that through the mountains. But while he was preparing thus to do, Mithridates came from the camp, a cousin of Manassas, of whom was related that he sought refuge with the Romans, and received in gift from Antony 3 cities. Upon his arrival, he desired somebody might be brought to him that could speak Syriac or Parthian. One Alexander of Antioch, a friend of Antony's, was brought to him, to whom stranger giving him his name and mentioning Manassas as a person who desired to do the kindness, and put the question, did he see the high range of hills pointing at some distance?